In this video, we're going to talk about LINQ, specifically the most generic form of LINQ called LINQ to objects. We're going to cover all the typical introductory material, such as the whys and the wherefores, and the different strains of LINQ that are in the wild. We're going to look at the difference between the language-integrated query syntax versus the method syntax. And then in the very next video, we're going to spend the majority of our time looking at a number of small examples featuring LINQ in action. Now also, honestly, this is going to be a video that's going to be slide only, lecture only. So if you want to just hide it behind the other windows you have and surf the net while you're listening to this, feel free, unless you just like looking at me while I talk. Anyway, so what exactly is LINQ? It's a SQL-like syntax that you've already seen a little bit of. It allows you to filter, sort, or group data in a list. Virtually any listing of data, as long as that data is in a container that somehow is implemented either IEnumerable or some other similar type of interface that can be iterated through. So what makes LINQ special is that it works for all types of data. It's a unified approach, so you don't need to learn different APIs or different methods for working with XML versus working with a collection of objects or working with data that you retrieve from SQL Server and so on. So the same basic syntax and the methods, they apply regardless of the type of data that you're working with. So in the past you had to learn a different API whenever you sat down to work with XML and a dramatically different API whenever you worked with ADO.NET to retrieve data from a database. And still a dramatically different API to work with collections or arrays of data, and so on. Today with LINQ, it sits as a layer above all of those. So you don't have to worry about the down and dirty code that you used to have to work with different types of data groupings. The idea is that it'd be easy for somebody to pick up and utilize one form of LINQ if they're already familiar with another form of LINQ. So some have even created a link to Amazon and some other really unique flavors of LINQ as a way of demonstrating its utility in that regard. So LINQ is also the first fruits of a new movement within Microsoft, which some have called declarative programming. So in this context, declarative programming means that you should be able to describe what outcome that you want, and then you allow Microsoft, your computer, the compiler, all of that, to figure out how best to achieve that for you. So you would rely on LINQ, the particular provider for LINQ, whether that provider is for LINQ to entities or LINQ to XML or LINQ to objects, to determine the best way to implement the instructions that you've given it, and then it worries about the down and dirty details. So you don't have to worry about the underlying API. It replaces it with a syntax that allows you to express your intent, and then the compiler and the APIs determine how best to parse your intent and produce the results that you desire. So there's a small bit of controversy about this very thing with regards to previously LINQ to SQL and now LINQ to entities. So the database access version of LINQ that we saw earlier, we called it LINQ to entities. There was also something before that called LINQ to SQL. In that case, LINQ to entities creates a SQL query on the fly that expresses your intent that it interprets from the LINQ syntax in your C# code. So the controversy is that many database administrators are skeptical whether an auto-generated method for determining the most efficient way to query a database can actually work. And so we're going to talk more about performance considerations later, but for now, the LINQ to entities developers inside of Microsoft, they insist that in a majority of cases, they can automatically generate better, more efficient SQL than you can, or at least most developers can. So I'm going to take Microsoft at their word on that, even though I have a small bit of reservation as well. If those are concerns as you're developing an application, then there's only really one way to find out, and that is to measure the amount of time it takes on a battery of tests using stored procedures versus a battery of tests run using only LINQ to entities. Within your environment, which is the winner, go with that. So LINQ really provides two major benefits. The first one is simplification. Learn one general approach to working with sets of data, or rather sequences of data, to use the proper LINQ vernacular. And secondly, to increase the speed with which a developer can develop an application. So we've already seen how extension methods can reduce dozens of lines of code to perform complex sorting and filtering down to just a single method call. And LINQ provides a number of extension methods to make our code really compact. So when working with different types of data, you no longer need to explicitly worry about many of the details of connections and commands and getting the data that's returned into some usable form. It works like you would expect it to work if you're already familiar with collections and links to LINQ to objects. You can just plug it in and go with it and expect it to do what you need it to do. So it simplifies things and it makes it faster to develop applications. As I mentioned earlier, for the remainder of today, in the remainder of the videos in this day's worth of lessons, we're going to be covering LINQ to objects, which is the most generic form of LINQ that works with collections and arrays. So later we're going to cover the variants of LINQ, such as LINQ to entities, which, as you already know, allows you to use LINQ against a SQL Server database or any kind of database, and LINQ to XML, which works with XML documents, and perhaps other forms of LINQ as they become available. There's also an older technology I alluded to just a moment ago called LINQ to SQL. It's largely been replaced by LINQ to entities, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time about it on this video series. So, LINQ to objects. The first thing that's important to understand is that there's two ways to use LINQ. The first way is referred to as method syntax, meaning that you use it like any other API, calling methods, passing in parameters. You've seen that a dozen times already. That's called the method syntax of LINQ. Those methods are implemented as extension methods, like we covered previously in Day 9's lesson. You can even chain them together, like we did previously, so you can put multiple extension method calls on a single line of code, making it very compact. So I know some people who only use the method syntax format for LINQ. However, Microsoft's idea was to leverage your existing knowledge of SQL, Transact SQL, since that's a declarative language as well that's used to specify the data that you want to retrieve from a data store. They modified it so that it'll be friendly within a programming environment and created the language integrated query syntax, which they dub as LINQ. It's kind of self-referential. So there's LINQ integrated query syntax, which looks like SQL, and then there's the method syntax, which looks like every other kind of C# when you're calling API methods. So the language integrated query syntax added a number of new keywords to C# and also Visual Basic, and those language additions are nothing more than shortcuts to the underlying method calls of the LINQ API. So while technically the LINQ to objects API is not part of the C# language, the language integrated syntax is part of the C# syntax, and the two are inextricably tied together. So instead of creating two separate videos for each concept, what I'm going to do in every video from this point on regarding LINQ to objects is show you both the method syntax and the language integrated query syntax. So you can see how to create the same intent using both styles, and then you can decide for yourself which one's right for you. Performance-wise, I think they're pretty much going to perform exactly the same unless you're iterating through something a million times. Then you may want to give some consideration to performance and how it's implemented under the hood. Most of us will never have a need for that. Okay. So enough about the theory in the background. I apologize for the slide-based nature of this presentation. In the next video, we're going to look at a dozen, maybe more, quick examples that should lead to some more interesting explanations and explorations of the topic of LINQ. So we're going to see you in the next video. Thank you.